Hey, friends in the Pacific Southwest District. It's Mission Exec Pastor Dominic Rivkin here again with another conversation. And I was just thinking about something I had heard when I first started in ministry, and that it was that the pastor, the leader, really needed to be an agent of calm in an anxious situation. I'll tell you what, I mean, this couldn't be a more anxious situation for the people we're talking to, right? I mean, you're calling congregants, you're talking to staff, you might be talking to teachers or parents, and you're feeling their anxiety. And sometimes it's like, what do I say? What do I talk about? I need to ask a question, and I'm not even sure what question to ask. Well, I thought about this a little bit and prayed on it. And I thought, there's a guy I know that the only skill he has is in asking good questions. And it's a friend of mine. His name is Jonathan Reitz. He's the CEO of CoachNet Global. He's been a friend and a coach to me for years. And I'll tell you what, there is nobody better to talk about how to ask good questions in a crisis, how to really get at the root of a solution for somebody, move them forward so that they're not stuck anymore and they can move forward in what it is that God is calling them to do. So I want to introduce you to Jonathan. We're just going to have a conversation about what he says are four critical questions for when we're facing a crisis. So welcome, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Well, thanks, Dominic. Appreciate the chance
Yeah.
to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. And you're right, this truly is the only skill I've got. So hopefully it'll be helpful.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So tell us, what would be the first question you would ask? I mean, you're on the phone with maybe a teacher or a congregant, and you just want to ask that poignant question that's going to openly start the conversation.
Before we get into that first one, let's talk about a precondition just for a second.
Oh, okay.
And this comes back to the days. This is something I wish I would have known when I was on church staff, when I was a church planter. I wish I would have understood this about crisis times, because I think this is absolutely critical. First of all, as the absolute underlying precondition for those moments when you're talking to that person on the phone, and that is, we're not going to solve this.
Mm.
We're not going to get at the root cause and fix it in one conversation. In a time like what we have going on right now with COVID-19 sweeping the globe, we're not going to fix that. We're not going to remove with a few questions why we're feeling anxious or why we're feeling fearful. What we can do in a conversation or a couple of conversations is decide how we're going to deal with it, is change our response to what's going on in those moments. And that's really critical for us to walk into these question asking opportunities, to be able to say, bottom line, we're going to adjust how we deal with what goes on around us as our target. That's what we're aiming for in all of this, is we're going to make a different choice about dealing with this situation as best we can. All right. So
I love that. Make a different choice about dealing with this. I love it.
yeah, we're just here to deal. We're just here to deal with what it is that we've got going on. We're not going to be able to fix something in a single conversation. And that little bit of perspective, like I say, I wish I had realized that when I was a church planter, because man, I can think about a couple of particular situations that probably bit off more than I could chew, based on what we were trying to accomplish at the moment in that conversation. It might have gone very, very differently. All right. So with that as a foundational sort of precondition, let's talk about four specific questions. First of all, what are you afraid of specifically? And here's the thing about this is it's personal, it's specific, it's contextual. It's based on what's going on around you at this moment. And it really does vary from person to person. If I'm honest with you right now, what I'm afraid of in light of the, personally, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic is really two things. I'm afraid that someone in my family is going to get really, really sick and never be the same again. I'm not afraid of, it doesn't scare me as much that I would get sick.
Mm-hmm.
but it scares me that my wife or my daughter or my 91-year-old mother or my brother or someone in his family would get sick and never be the same again.
Hmm.
That really what I'm afraid of there is not the sickness, it's the permanent change that might come out of this.
Mm.
And it's scary because it's unknown. So I want to challenge you that when you ask that question, don't let the person off the hook without them being specific about, hey, what actually is it that you're afraid of?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
that's
I,
where the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, no, I love that. And don't let it off the hook. Don't just let that question die. Of course, let the person talk it through. But I love this follow-up is, and what would you do if you weren't afraid?
Mm-hmm.
So now, right? So it moves it from this, what are you afraid of, to, oh, wait, here are my options. And they start to think through some of the different options that they have in order to get themselves unstuck from this fear, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we do in executive coaching is we'll take a response to some hard question like that, hard, open-ended, big, broad question like, what are you afraid of? We'll take that and then we'll spend the next little time reframing that example, that response, into something that doesn't have to be scary, but might actually be an opportunity. Like I was talking to a coaching client this morning, I guess it was yesterday morning actually, and he said, "You know what? I'm afraid that all of my clients are going to leave me as a result of this guy's a lawyer.
Mm,
I'm afraid all of my clients are going to leave me as a result of this pandemic, and the ones that don't won't be afraid to pay their bill." Okay, fair
mm.
enough. Let's say you didn't have all those other clients. What kind of law would you practice then?
Wow.
And
Yeah.
he completely changed his attitude, his tone, and he began to see this as, you know what, maybe this will be okay. I don't really want to have to deal with the process of getting there, but maybe once I do actually get there, it'll be okay. So that reframing is really critical, especially when somebody acknowledges their fear, because
Hmm.
often hidden under a layer or two or three or 10 of fear is some really positive outcome that we can celebrate, we can grab onto and celebrate. And that's especially true when Jesus is in control, which is pretty regularly
Absolutely.
if we step back from it.
Absolutely. We have the Lord who says that he defeats all fear, right?
Yeah.
Light in the darkness. And so it's hard to see. We have a lot invested into what it is that we do, right? Every single
Hmm.
day, no matter what it is, we have a lot invested into that. And when we're getting pressure from all sides, it may be hard to see the light. So what other questions do you have that would help with that?
All right. In light of what is on the table now, because you've
Mhm.
named what you're afraid of, let's begin to explore that a little bit differently. Okay. So, in light of what you're afraid of, how does that affect your vocation? Just very simply, how does that affect your job? How does that affect the way you support yourself? What are the implications of that fear on that particular uh, professional life? Now, like for example, in my own case, I'm an executive coach. I work with a bunch of clients all over the globe. Who knows how many of them will continue with me after this is over? Which means the opportunity that's there, if I can focus, if I can force myself to think about the opportunity, is I might get to take on some new and interesting folks and
Mm,
help them figure out a way to live into their uniqueness, into their calling, into their vocational clarity, like I have with my existing clients. Now, if I get caught up in the fact that, wow, this is scary, I could lose half or 80% of my business, and oh my goodness, my kid wants to eat every day. If I get caught up in that kind of stuff, that can be very fearful and very scary, and it can be very paralyzing. The thinking about the implications and finding that moment of lightness inside of the implications, that's the way through it. So I
yeah.
want to I want to challenge you that once the fear is on the table, to think, okay, what does that mean for your vocation? What does that mean
Yeah.
for your calling? Now, if you're a church worker or a called worker, your vocation doesn't change.
Mm,
Just the how and the what that you do to make that happen
Oh, that's
might be
good.
adjusted a little bit. But your vocation doesn't change.
Mhm.
Like if you are called to be the principal of a school, you know what? That's still your calling.
Yeah.
COVID-19 can't touch that. It might look a little different. You might be principal of an online school. You might be training a whole bunch of homeschool teachers
Mm.
through that process, but you're still called to be the principal of a school.
Oh, that's so good. That is so good. And we really do have to think of vocation as being way more holistic and deeper.
Hmm.
I mean, what have we've heard it, if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life, right?
Hmm.
But vocation definitely extends far beyond that. Not only professionally, but we need to remember personally as well. And I really see
Yeah.
that this question kind of feeds into that same thing of, right, this is what you do outwardly in the world. What about here? What about the vocation
Yeah.
here? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would urge you to think about it. A mutual friend of yours and mine, Pastor Mike Perkinson, talks about
Mm,
splitting vocation into a couple of different pieces. He'll talk about your destiny. Hey, what's this big picture thing that you're called to do, to accomplish? And that might be in your family. It might be in your community.
hmm
It might be in your professional life or in your church. But then there's also a legacy component of our vocation: is what are we leaving behind?
mm,
And I'm not sure that one's going to be touched that much by any crisis that might go on around us. We're still called to leave the same impact. It's just a question of how do we do that in a way that lines up to the vocation or the calling that we've embraced, that we've grabbed onto. So, you know,
mm,
how does this affect your vocation, your calling, your destiny, your legacy,
yeah.
if that fear is living in
Definitely, definitely. It should, and as we unpack, or as the person that we're talking to unpacks that vocation, what's really important is going to bubble to the top, which I suspect isn't what you do day to day. It's
you? Hmm.
probably a little bit deeper, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I suspect it is. It's interesting. One of the things the COVID-19 pandemic has done for me personally is it's caused me to revisit my vision, the thing that I see my life aiming toward.
Mm,
And a bunch of stuff has fallen away as I've gotten older. I've realized, okay, that was something that a young person would pursue. It's not really the implication of that are not that profound. The thing that's been consistent and nonstop for me is I want to be in a position to be generous no matter what.
mm, yeah.
And you know what? COVID-19 can't touch that either.
Yeah.
The whoever's president of the United States can't touch that. Who whatever circumstances are going on around me can't touch that. Because I don't just mean financially generous. I mean relationally generous. I mean socially generous. I mean generous with love. I mean cleaning out my closet on a regular basis, and because I have the ability to accumulate, sharing some of that ability to accumulate with people who maybe have a different ability to accumulate. It means inviting folks to dinner at our house on a consistent and regular basis. Generosity oozes into the cracks of life if you let it, and it's a pretty incredible cement holding the pieces together if you let it to. Also a question of vocational clarity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how else might this fear play out? What other questions you got?
Okay, two more. I got two more for
Okay.
you. First, third one. So first was, what are you afraid of? Second, how does that affect your vocation, your calling? Let's go now to how does that fear affect your relationships?
Mm,
And I mean all kinds of different relationships. Um, my wife is afraid of nothing. She is steely eyed. She looks at whatever circles around us and says, "Yeah, not today," because of the faith that lives in her. My daughter is put together a little bit differently. So she needs to see her mom and me being strong, being bold, and that rubs off on her. Now, how does the fear that you are feeling affect your relationships?
Mm.
If you're called to be a non-anxious presence, the fear that you can acknowledge in yourself will trickle down into those relationships. Might make you less bold in a time like this.
Mm.
It might,
Yeah.
it might, and this I think is a really positive thing. I suspect this happens to you. I mean, I'm gonna put you on the spot here, Dominic. Yeah, because he doesn't know what I'm about to say. But I'm gonna put you on the spot here. I suspect when you acknowledge you're feeling somewhat fearful, you double down and invest more deeply in the relationships with the people around you.
Yeah, guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
guilty.
the thing I admire about you, and this is a lesson that I take from you every time I'm around you, is that I don't think that necessarily comes naturally. I think that's learned behavior. That's redeemed behavior in you.
Mm.
And that, in the 10 or 12 or 14 years I've known you, that's something I've seen grow in you. And that's the thing about why paying attention to how your fear affects your relationship is so important, is because those are the people that are going to point out when you're growing or when you're slipping.
Oh boy.
And
Yeah. Oh
yeah. I mean,
boy. Yeah.
one of my mentors who was a profound effect on me, a guy named Bob Logan, said to me, the biggest leadership challenge you will ever have, is how to deepen relationships when things aren't going according to plan.
Hmm.
And if you can't acknowledge how your fear is affecting your relationships, you've just taken the legs out from under the possibility of your leadership. That's why this is so important. That's why this is so
Yeah, that's
important.
truth. Wow, that's huge. That's
In your
huge.
in your congregation, in your community, in your family, in your marriage, in the casual encounters you have with people at the grocery store, assuming your governor allows you to go to the grocery store.
Hmm.
Every single one of those situations is an opportunity to acknowledge that your fear is not going to shut down your relationships.
Yep.
So,
Yep. And I think it's so dependent on that key relationship that we have with God to us.
mm-hmm,
If we know who we truly are, right,
mm-hmm,
as God's own children, well, other things tend to fall into place. They fall into at least the proper perspective, right?
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. And that brings up the fourth question, which is, how does your fear affect your identity?
Yep.
How does your fear affect how you see yourself? I know someone who, in light of all of what's going on around us at this moment, has decided to double down by purchasing a number of firearms and
Mm.
hundreds of rounds of ammo, because this person is convinced that the apocalypse is coming. Not the Jesus coming back for the second time apocalypse, but
Hmm.
the, oh my gosh, we're all going to kill each other apocalypse.
Mm.
And that is changing this person's identity.
Mm.
That fear is causing this person to do things that they would not do on a regular basis.
Mm. Yeah, biblically speaking, the identity of fear is exactly the opposite identity that we were created with, right? So
Yes.
the first thing that happens is Adam and Eve hide behind a bush because they're afraid. That's
Yep.
not their identity. They've lost
Right.
their identity. Yeah.
Right. So staying in touch. I want to challenge everyone who's watching this to spend a moment every morning with just a simple prayer along the lines of, Lord, remind me of who I am.
Mm.
Remind me of whose I am. Remind me of how those two things overlap and intersect, so that I can
Hmm.
live out in my relationships, in my vocation, and with a spirit of boldness, not a spirit of fear. I read that somewhere,
Hmm.
that that would be the thing that would define me, because it flows out of the identity that you've given me, Lord. I take great comfort. In fact, I was thinking about this morning before I was even out of bed. I take great comfort that you and I, all of us, have a name that is written in the book of heaven that we don't even know yet,
Yeah.
but Jesus does.
Mm-hmm.
And that name will be revealed at some point. You know, I kind of like my current name, but I know the next one is going to be even better.
So I'm a little bit surprised actually then, because why did you go in this order with the questions? Because that sounds so critical. I mean,
You're right. You're right. The identity question is at the heart of it all, and it is so tempting for us to start there. But you know what? The vast majority of the time, unless you've got a really special relationship with someone, we don't have permission to start there.
oh yeah.
Think about that moment. We've all been there. Sitting there. Remember back when you used to get on airplanes? Sit down on an airplane and you make eye contact with that person sitting next to you. You know what the next question is, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we are naturally conditioned to start. So if you can engage around, hey, what's scaring you about this situation? How does that affect your job? Now you're on a pathway that will get to the place where, you know what, you might be able to talk about this identity, this God-given identity, that this name that Jesus has given you that you don't even know yet, something that's that personal, that's tied into things like identity. You might be able to get there, but it's much harder to get there if you start there. So I want to invite you to invert the curve a little bit. You know, we're talking about flattening the curve. This is flat out inverting it to what our tendency is, to start with, hey, tell me about yourself. Now, what do you do? How does what's going on around here currently affect that? Oh, interesting. How about that affect your other relationships, not just your coworkers, but your other relationships? Interesting. All right. So how's it changing you? Now we're taking variations of those questions and we're letting the other person give us permission to ask more and more meaningful questions that are built on, what are you going to do about this in light of who Jesus made you to be?
Oh, this is so good, Jonathan. And it's exactly what I prayed for this conversation, is that with all of the conversations that we're having, be they on video or on the phone or whatever, just connecting and contacting people, staying in contact with them, is how do we get to that point to where we get to what's really real? Yeah, what is this doing to you? And it's my prayer that when this all eases, we get just a whole lot of people who are on fire for who God is and who they are in God, and to realize that we've just equipped the body of saints to do the work of ministry in amazing ways, just by a few questions. So
start with what people will be willing to give you, and as you talk more, they'll be willing to give you even more, and you will get there. Well, you know, it's not scary to talk about what scares you. It's not scary to talk about how that affects your job. It starts getting to be a little bit more personal, a little bit scary when you start getting into how does this affect your relationships. But once you demonstrate that you can be trusted with that, people will be ready, willing, and excited to tell you about how this is changing them.
Love it.
And that's where it gets good.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. This was really a great conversation. And I look forward to some of the future videos that I'm thinking about working on. One of them was really based in what Jonathan was talking about, that sort of morning practice of how we're communicating with God in this. You know, how are we centered? How are each of us centered in Christ to then connect with others? I think it's absolutely critical for all of mission, but especially in this time of crisis more than ever. So I want to thank you all for joining us again, and we'll see you next time.